Prof, Teng, Singapore imports 90% of its food requirement from overseas. Yet it is ranked number one on the Global Food Security Index. What are the lessons that the international community can learn from small nation states like Singapore?
Okay. There are, in fact, several important lessons. I think one is that as a small country, Singapore very explicitly recognizes that it can only produce a very small amount of its own food, it has to import. Now, to deal with this need to import, it has in place explicit policy to have very diverse sources of food imports for the same food item that are spread out geographically. Okay, in other words, different continents, but also in terms of time, temporally. In other words, different growing seasons. Okay, now what this allows the country to do is to hedge its bets. That should any particular source country not be able to export, then there are other countries that can do so equally and are not affected by the factors that might be causing a disruption in production within one country. But having said that, what is also important is that Singapore has both the infrastructure and the logistical support to import through multiple supply chains, and that really is quite key. And so that's the first point I would use to explain why Singapore is so high. In other words, the availability of food is assured. The second really, to add on the food availability, is also to ensure that the food that comes in Singapore is affordable. That's a very key element. And this is part of, both availability and affordability are part of the FAO's four dimensions of food security. Okay? In terms of affordability, the imperative here really is to ensure that Singapore households have high enough incomes to make food expenditure only a minor part of their total expenses. Okay? And this, in fact, is a very strategic thinking on the part of Singapore. Because of the land limitation, the government decided to invest in higher value adding activities like financing, manufacturing, and so on, all of which helps to raise the average GDP per capita. And by raising the average GDP per capita, people can then afford to buy food, and food then becomes only a small part of the total household expenditure. And this is very significant, in fact. When we do the deeper analysis, into this ranking, we find that there's a very strong correlation, in fact, between household income and affordability to buy food. And in Singapore, other data sets, attest to this. The average Singapore household spends less than 10% of its household income on food. And this compares very markedly with our neighboring countries like Indonesia and Philippines, where the average household spends minimally 35 to 40% of its household income on food, which means that anytime food prices go up, households are affected. Yeah? So having the capacity to buy food, okay, as expressed through GDP, gross domestic product, per capita is very important indeed. And Singapore is very fortunate in that sense. That also accounts for the high food affordability that we have here in Singapore. Now, the third, I think that we recognize here in Singapore to account for high food security is having some level of self-production of strategic food items to allow us to buffer those periods when there is uncertainty in supply, which is why the government has in place certain targets for self-production, for fish, for vegetables, and for eggs. Okay, although implicit in that too is that we still have to import from elsewhere, which is why the supply chain assurance is so important. So I would say these would be three kind of reasons, to help us explain why we was so high in food security. Yeah.